Okay, so let's get cracking. We've got a few more people that are joining us, but hopefully that will just be during the introduction. So welcome back. We hope you all enjoyed the workshops you've just been at. We're now going to run our last session of the HVG conference 2023, and that's our panel discussion. So I'm Rhiannon Green, I'm the events executive for HVG, and I'll be chairing today's session. Today's session's all about virtual volunteering, its role in creating inclusive programmes. So a huge thank you to everyone who's pre-submitted questions. We've had a little look at them and we've condensed them down and added a few in. So we were in for a really good session to take us to the end of the conference. So just to briefly introduce our lovely panellists, we have got Alex Fitzpatrick, who's Research Fellow at the Science Museum. We have Ben Marsh, Programme Development Manager for Volunteering at Barnsley Museums. We have Katrin Podgorski, Project and Volunteer Manager for Heritage Access 2022 and Vocalise. And we have Jeff Belknap, Keeper for the Department of Science and Technology at the National Museum of Scotland. And you'll have met many of our panellists throughout the sessions that we've had over the last 2 days. A huge welcome to the four of you and thank you so much for joining in. So what we're going to do, we're going to run through the questions. I'll direct some at our entire panel and then we'll direct some just at the odd member or so. But if any of our panelists want to jump in, raise your virtual hand or literally stick it up and we can absolutely hear anything you want to add to the discussions. So we're going to go straight off. So for the first question, I'm going to direct it at all of you. Can you tell us a little bit about the most successful volunteering opportunity in the virtual world, virtual volunteering opportunity that you're aware of and why you consider it so? It could be one that you've been involved in, or it could be one that you just are aware of. And to start with, I'll go in alphabetical order and we'll keep shaking it up as we go through. So I'm going to come to Ben first. Sorry, Ben, you start with B.
Fair enough. I'm going to sound a bit cloying, but actually, Katrin's Vocalise project is probably one of the best. I was very lucky that we were both in the same tranche of funding for National Lottery Heritage Fund. But what an amazing virtual project that was both focused on access as an output in terms of how heritage websites do that, but also was so accessible to lots of people who might not have traditionally been able to volunteer. So yeah, it sounds a little bit cloying, but yeah, I definitely feel that's a really good example. And if you've not encountered it, look at Vocalise's Heritage Report 2022. It's an amazing piece of work. But also, yeah, if you get a chance to find out about how the volunteer programme operated, I would fully recommend it.
Lovely, thank you, Ben, and perhaps one of my colleagues on the committee can pop a reference to that in the chat. Over to you, Katrin. What would be your example?
I didn't even pay Ben to say that. Amazing, thank you. Thanks, Ben. That was really kind. I think it's honestly difficult to pick just one, and I was kind of, when you sent over the panel questions, I was racking my brains because one of the best things about virtual volunteering is that you can have projects of all sizes. You're not limited by the amount of people you can fit in a room, for example, with health and safety. You're not limited by kind of the outreach that you can do in your local community. And I think a good example of that, it's one of the biggest in the world, is the Smithsonian Transcription Center, which is across the pond in Washington DC. But I recently spoke with Emily, who's the community manager, to just talk about the sheer scale of the project. And I think you can measure impact of virtual volunteering again in a lot of different ways to in-person volunteering. But if we're going kind of by scale, I think Emily said that they've worked since 2013, have worked with over 83,000 digital volunteers, most of whom have only engaged a couple of times. And due to the nature of the project, you know, they're transcribing, so they'll log on, transcribe one, and then maybe never engage again. But I think the sheer numbers and therefore the awareness of the project and of the institution, I would say that the work that they're doing there is phenomenal. They've transcribed over 1.2 million pages of records kept in the Smithsonian Archive. So yeah, I would really shout out about them.
Lovely, thank you, Katrin. And actually, anyone who I was just checking that you're all awake, because you'll have spotted I can't actually read the alphabet already, because Alex should have gone first. So we're going to go to Alex third instead. So wake up, everyone, if you didn't realise that. Alex, apologies, come to you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a bit of a cheat because there are loads of really great Zooniverse projects going on, working with digital volunteers from around the world. But to like particularly highlight one, they did one, I forget what year it was, somewhat recently. They had the Agents of Enslavement project, which was a really interesting project in which volunteers transcribed colonial newspapers from the Caribbean to kind of identify, the voices of enslaved people that were within these newspapers. And it's an interesting project because it's so challenging, a very challenging topic to utilize for a kind of wide-scale volunteering projects like this. And it was partially some of the inspiration we took for working with communities and crowds, as we had similarly challenging content that we were working with. But it's a nice kind of example, at least, of showcasing that you don't have to shy away from really challenging and contested elements of heritage when you're doing volunteering projects like this. You can do it in a way that is safe and supported as well, and hopefully inspires people to kind of take more risks as far as tackling this kind of challenging content in their work.
Lovely, thank you, Alex. And last but not least, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, to echo Alex, I think for me, in order to find some of the best virtual volunteering, we need to look outside of the GLAM sector itself. So we need to look at the big platforms. Zooniverse, as Alex has mentioned, I think is the biggest of it. It has, Smithsonian, as Katrine pointed out, is great, but Zooniverse's reach is 2.6 million people, right? It's a global audience with thousands of different projects. And I think they are a top-down citizen science platform, but I think they're working to change that. But outside of that, I think there's a lot of other, I think thinking about virtual volunteering in the frame of crowdsourcing more generally, I think would be really useful. So there's other great projects like Transcribus as an example, or Micropasts that the British Museum did now a decade ago. But there's lots of other examples in the museum sector. I think the British Library is doing a lot of really great work in this area. So I would look toward the crowdsourcing sector and the digital humanities sector for inspiration.
Lovely, thank you. And the reason for starting off with that is to get a bit of a sense of what you think is some of the best out there. But a lot of the questions from our membership was about good examples that people could look at and take inspiration from. So I really wanted to start us off with a mix of different examples to think about. So thank you for that. I hope that's given you lots of food for thought. So the Time Well Spent 2023 update indicated that virtual volunteering is here to stay. Is this something that you think heritage organisations should be prioritising, and why? I'm going to come to Jeff to start with on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I still have my mic on. So yeah, absolutely. Organizational advocacy is really hard, I think. So being able to demonstrate the potential reach of virtual volunteering is the first start. I think, and my institution here is a good example of that. I think institutions are very good at looking at driving footfall into museums and using our volunteering and our digital platforms to drive footfall in. But what we need to start thinking about is how these potentials give us global reach. And I mean that in the true sense that some of these platforms really can reach all countries all across the space, and we can start to I think it takes the advocacy work takes being able to argue for a different concept of who we're talking to and who our audiences might be. But I think that has real potential. I think that's where we need to go, is trying to demonstrate we could be bringing in communities from China or from South America into our virtual volunteering, because the potential is there.
Thank you, Jeff. And that's a really great point, because a lot of our members expressed sort of uncertainty about how to almost advocate for delivering these kinds of projects within their organizations. So I think you've made some really great points there about extending your audience, that global reach, increasing basically the visibility of the message of your organization ultimately. Lovely. I'm going to come to Ben, who's situated within a museum and a heritage organization, just to see what your take on this is. Do you think this is something we should be prioritising, and why?
I do, 100%. We weren't particularly, so just taking the pandemic, where digital obviously really came more fully into its own, we weren't prepared for that from a volunteering perspective, and our volunteering offer simply stopped. And it really got us thinking about that, and made us realise that we weren't tapping into a potential huge resource of volunteering. Digital volunteering is, it seems in my experience so far, to attract people who are after those really highly flexible, almost on their own terms roles, which we aren't always able to offer in museums when we have strict opening times and you have to be in the building and, you know, all of those things. So yeah, I definitely think so. And just taking the time well spent itself, I think it was 18% of people surveyed in that said virtual digital volunteering was their method of volunteering. It was how they volunteered. So if you think that's, you know, nearly 20% of your potential volunteers might end up wanting to be virtual, it's a huge volunteer resource that could do incredible things for you. So yeah, I 100% agree. We as a sector need to be looking at that. We need to be thinking about how virtual volunteer coordinators exist and what that role looks like and how we do that going forward.
Ben, and yeah, absolutely. We're going to touch on a few of those things in shortly. And I think just to add to that point about kind of how you influence your team sideways, upwards, downwards, resources like Time Well Spent 2023 can really help you with that clear data that shows you it's not just a fad, it's a growing way that people want to engage with organizations, really powerful as well. Alex, Katrin, anything that you would like to come in and add on that?
I think I'd like to say that I hope it's here to stay. We've seen the vast benefits of virtual volunteering, and I think, as Jeff was saying, that kind of international reach is really important. But even scaling it down to just thinking about the UK, I've found that virtual volunteering eliminates a lot of the limits that in-person volunteering has. Particularly one of them being that we can engage with people who are housebound, or they are clinically extremely vulnerable during the ongoing COVID pandemic, and therefore cannot come to site and volunteer in a way that they might have done previous to COVID. So I really hope it's here to stay, because I feel like it can be, if it's delivered with access kind of at the forefront of your mind, it can be much more inclusive than in-person volunteering. So I hope so.
Lovely. And we'll come back to you in a minute, Alex, because I just want to touch on what Katrin said, because one of the points that's been raised by some of our members is that some organisations state technology as a bit of a barrier to virtual volunteering, and that might be infrastructure from the organisation, it might be personal equipment and ability. And so I wonder if, Alex, it may be that you've got an opinion about the earlier question, but if anyone's got any thoughts on any evidence or stats that could give us a sense of where we digitally are as a population, and how ready we are really to make this truly accessible in that wider range. So I'm just adding that in there, but Alex, if you want to come in with your thoughts, and then we can pick that up.
I mean, I was just going to agree with what Katrin said as far as virtual volunteering is a disability issue. It's not a solution to all disability issues, obviously. Virtual volunteering comes with its own barriers for certain people. But in my experience, having the virtual option has been really useful for people who are autoimmune or compromised, who can't go in person, people who are housebound, people who, like me, have mobility issues that kind of limit the amount of in-person work you can do. And I think that does also tie in as well the idea that, even though it's a boon in a lot of ways for increasing inclusivity, it's not the be-all end-all. There is things such as digital poverty that we need to contend with. I think your question was more about the technical barriers for institutions, but I think it's also important to note that it goes both ways. There are still many people, I don't know the stats offhand, but there's still many people in the UK who do not have the same access to computers, to Wi-Fi, to other technical aspects that we assume everyone else does. And part of how we work with virtual volunteering is to keep that in mind, that, you know, if we're hoping to be inclusive in the way we do virtual volunteering, it may also need to think about the people who potentially want to volunteer virtually but don't have the means to. What does that look like as far as facilitating that as well?
Absolutely, great point, that digital poverty piece goes both ways, and it's not just about an organisation. Anything to add to that? The point about kind of how digitally ready we are as a society to really increase this.
When you get out into the rural areas, there's very many people still haven't got electricity, let alone anything else. You know, it's only really the big cities and the spine areas that have got electricity and have got telephones and have got internet. You know, we're very much assuming that everybody's got access to everything, and they haven't.
Thank you for that contribution. I'm not sure who that came from in the audience, but I really appreciate that. Does anyone want to say anything about the kind of rural-urban divide for from our panel? Perhaps Jeff, if you want to say something about.
Yeah, it is a really excellent point. I think going back to the point that Alex made, that I think we need the pandemic really demonstrated how much digital poverty we have across the whole of the UK, and that a lot of that is the digital poverty is exacerbated by infrastructure issues, whether that's in rural areas and the lack of infrastructure, but there's also quite a lot of that in city centers. You know, we were when Alex and I were working together, we were in Bradford, and Bradford is a very socioeconomically deprived city, so delivering working to think about digital delivery is also thinking about local communities. Just because we were thinking at the time during the pandemic and afterwards about digital tools and digital spaces that we could expand to, we were also thinking about not actually going much outside of Bradford itself, but bringing those tools to local Bradford communities and thinking a lot more specifically about what the barriers to access were within the city centre itself. I think was a critical point for us.
Yeah, and actually Sonia from our memberships made a note in the comments about that they couldn't even get their cataloguing system to work in the stores in Bradford, let alone externally to the city. So yeah, absolutely. I think we definitely hear the point about the kind of rural infrastructure, but that's not to say that the urban situations are completely equipped yet either. So I think with that is an acknowledgement that virtual volunteering can increase accessibility to the audiences we've chatted about, but as Alex, you know, quite rightfully said earlier, it isn't the be all and end all yet, and there's still a long way to go around that sort of digital poverty and infrastructure investment. So absolutely. We're going to move on to a slightly different angle. So lots of questions about how to sort of engage in virtual volunteering and how to really kind of get going. And there was a lot of questions around kind of the promotion of it and whether it looks different really to other ways that you promote more traditional forms of volunteering. So my question to the audience, and we'll come to Katrin first perhaps on this one, is does the promotion of virtual opportunities look different to other volunteering opportunities? And do you have any tips on how to reach a diverse audience for virtual projects rather than using a single get involved all request on social media platforms?
Yeah, so just a bit of a plug really. I've put it in the chat, but in our tranche of funding that Ben mentioned from the Heritage Fund, as part of it, all organisations had put together some how-to guides that have been published online, and ours was actually about recruiting for a virtual project with access and inclusion in mind. And I think that the biggest difference that I found when recruiting for virtual volunteering is reaching out on a kind of national scale. So being able to reach out to different regions and kind of I'm thinking about like volunteering for Scotland, for example, and Northern Ireland. I think the lottery fund, we did some outreach there, but also then drilling down into community volunteering groups within those regions. So kind of, if you imagine a map of the UK, we kind of divided it up into the regions as recognised by the Heritage Fund, and actually then went even further, looking at community volunteering officers, online notice boards that they have. I think about, for example, Info Volunteering Cumbria, for example, and really looking at it in a kind of macro than micro sense. Whereas with in-person volunteering, you might, as you mentioned, just kind of put one call out. You might use existing pools of volunteers, but we really wanted to reach as much of the UK as possible. So going for that kind of macro then micro approach was for us very successful. And we ended up having representation from all of the regions in England, and then from Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for sharing that resource. It sounds like a very good starting point for many of us embarking on this, perhaps for the first or early times. Ben, anything to add from you about what perhaps worked for you in the past?
I would second what Catherine has said, and I would, weirdly for us, some of our traditional methods of advertising also work just as well to recruit our virtual volunteers. So we have a strong social media presence. We access things like Leicester Museum's job desk. All of those things that we would use generally seem to also still generate for virtual volunteering, and perhaps actually engaged with people who were already an audience in other ways for us. You know, they might be following us because of our family offer or whatever. But then they could see a volunteer opportunity that actually did work for them through our traditional channel. So yeah, no, I would say all the things Catherine was talking about, but those traditional methods still did work for us as well. So I think it's probably just taking it as a whole, and as always with any volunteer recruitment, sometimes what you think is going to land doesn't, and you just have to kind of try it again somewhere else, or 6 months later, and suddenly it does take off again for some reason.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's loads of kind of crowdsourced, just to use Jeff's phrase from earlier, crowdsourced ideas going on in the chat. So make sure that you're having a look at that as we're concluding the panel discussion as well, because there's lots of alternative ideas in there. So we're going to move on to another area, because one of the other big areas that came out in the questions from our members was around kind of how to build a successful and engaged virtual volunteering community. I think, you know, most of us will have experience of doing that in the physical kind of in-person world, but how does that work, and what does that look like online? So we've had kind of questions around how you provide remote tech support. What does social opportunities look like in person and virtually, and what does buddying look like? So we've had a whole gamut of them. So I wonder whether I could ask a few people, what's worked for you to keep virtual volunteers engaged and connected, both to one another as a team and also to the organisation? Alex, should we come to you if you've got any thoughts on this one?
So one of the good things about us working with Universe for our project has been the fact that a lot of those kind of engagement tools are already built into the platform. So, you know, maintaining engagement with volunteers that are working digitally, particularly on a scale of Universe where they're working across the globe, having space for conversation. So Universe has like message boards that they refer to as talk, allowing the volunteers to engage within themselves, like amongst themselves, as well as, you know, staff members checking in occasionally. And that includes our in-person volunteers who have worked on the project were able to log on if they'd like to talk to some of the other volunteers. I think stuff like that is really important, making sure that there are consistent spaces for people to work together, to talk to each other, and if possible, to do it not at a set time. So for our volunteers, when we did move virtual, or at least our core volunteer group on Communities and Crowds, we did consistently still have online sessions where we would chat about what we were doing and things like that. But again, with Zooniverse having that kind of message board space, people could do that whenever they wanted to as well. So I think having both is really useful, because some people just want to chat while they're working and want to, you know, make some notes about things and engage other people about what they're doing. Since at least with our project, people were working on transcribing photographs at very different times across very different time zones. So yeah, obviously it depends on the scale that you're working on, but I think just in general, having spaces for conversation, whether it's structured or just kind of, you know, catching up, chatting and things like that are really important.
I think that's a lovely point. Thank you, Alex. And it's a good reminder that actually virtual does allow us to engage people globally. And actually it goes back to that age-old kind of question of getting to know your team a little bit and understanding where they're from, how they plan to engage with the project, and jumping off from there. And we can always ask people. Catherine, have you got any thoughts on how you foster that sense of community and what we can do as leaders?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about an example that I saw on LinkedIn the other day, actually from Sam, who's just been announced as Heritage Volunteer Leader of the Year, and it made me think a lot about the recognition that we give volunteers, and particularly virtual volunteers, because that's often such a big part of volunteering, is recognizing the inputs that volunteers have given to a project. And with virtual volunteering, actually making sure, I think, as someone else has mentioned, that we offer a hybrid approach where possible, so you don't isolate one half if you're doing a hybrid project, for example, and that with any in-person event, it is hybrid, so those who are purely remote can take part as well. And then for our project, in terms of more active day-to-day engagement, Matt mentioned that in the comments that we used a platform called Basecamp relatively successfully. I have to say it's not the most accessible platform. We had issues with screen reader users on the platform, but it offered a space that worked as both a place to put updates and kind of reminders of deadlines and things like that for our volunteers, but also offered, it's called, because it's Basecamp, it's called Campfire, where volunteers are encouraged to gather around the campfire, talk to each other, and kind of take it off of the platform as well, which worked relatively successfully for us and for our volunteers as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Catherine. And we are running out of time here, so Jeff and Ben have added some really insightful points into the chat, so please do make sure you catch those. It sounds like we could have had 3 hours for this discussion, so apologies that we've literally only had half an hour. We're going to end now, and I'm just going to ask our 4 panelists to provide us with one piece of advice that they wish they'd known before they started their first volunteering project. And then my promise to everyone otherwise is that we will look at ways that we can pick up this conversation in our usual HVG events run. Okay, so we're going to come to Alex first. One piece of advice for those starting out on virtual volunteering.
I think just to follow up what I was just saying before about the conversation is so important, and kind of consistent engagements. Whether, like I said, whether it's, you know, very distinctly talking about the project itself and making sure you have that consistent communication, or if it's just having space to chat about whatever. I think it's really easy to lose that kind of person-to-person touch with virtual volunteering, and just, you know, being able to have space for people to, you know, talk about whatever is useful, helps them build those connections that otherwise might be missed because we're kind of interfacing via screens. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Lovely, Alex. Ben?
That a really flexible volunteer offer is amazing, but it requires a really flexible response from you as an organisation, and that the volunteer coordinating resource to enable you to do that needs to be really in place and consistently with you all the time to make that offer continue at the pace you would want it to.
Great, great. Thank you, Ben. Katrin?
Ben stole my answer. No, I was also going to say that it takes, remember the amount of work that it takes to run a virtual volunteering program, and that all the wonderful things we've said today come from, I know from my own experience, that you know, this was my whole role, was doing this one thing, so it meant that I was able to dedicate a huge amount of time to it. And also to remember that if it's your first time doing something like this, you're going to be learning alongside the volunteers quite often. So listen to what they have to say, engage in both formal and informal evaluation, and be prepared to make changes as you go along, because what you start with might not be what you end with.
Great point. I think you could say that about most things, but definitely for this. Jeff, last words from you.
Yeah, I mean, just to reflect what Ben and Katrine said, the main learning is that anything virtual is not cost neutral or time neutral. It's not time saving or time or cost saving. It's the opposite of that. Before you do anything, spend a good year thinking about what you want to do and make sure you have the budget to be able to do it.
That's a brilliant point to end us on. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Alex, Ben, Katrin, Jeff, for a fascinating panel discussion. We could have been here for days. We will pick this up as an HVG team to keep the conversation going.